At that moment, a sharp slap resounded through the boarding gate, and an elderly woman's cane hit the floor. As she steadied herself and looked at the flight attendant who had just hit her, the whole terminal fell silent. Miss Pratt, the flight attendant, stood stiffly, her face red with anger. "I told you to step aside," she snapped, but the elderly woman didn't argue or raise her voice. Instead, she bent down, picked up her cane, and looked Miss Pratt in the eye. She looked him straight in the eyes and said in a quiet, steady voice, "You just made the worst mistake of your life. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe for more." The airport lounge was quiet, with only the soft clinking of coffee cups and the occasional murmur of conversation. In a corner near the window, Eloise Lancaster sat with her hands folded over the handle of her cane. She was dressed. She was wearing a simple navy blue dress and pinning her silver hair back. She didn't stand out from the other travelers waiting for their flights. She just watched the planes take off in the distance, her face calm as if she had done this a million times before. A young businessman named Dorian Vance, who was sitting nearby, noticed her and politely offered his seat. She gave him a small smile and thanked him, but she stayed where she was and didn't even look up. Most people didn't even look at her twice. At the check-in counter, flight attendants were busy organizing the boarding process, their voices clear as they directed passengers. Among them was a tall woman with sharp features and a name tag that said Miss Pratt. She moved with authority. She had worked in first class for years and carried herself like she owned the section. In the lounge, she scanned the passengers with a quick, practiced eye, noting who looked like they belonged in first class. She looked briefly at Eloise and then moved on, barely noticing her. She was more interested in the well-dressed business executives and famous travelers who would be expecting top-notch service when the first-class boarding announcement was made. Elle slowly rose to her feet, adjusted her cane's grip, and made her way toward the gate. She walked slowly, as if she had all the time in the world, watching the people around her rush through the line to get to their seats. She gave Miss Pratt her ticket at the door and she shook her hand firmly to stop her. "Ma'am, this is the first-class line," Miss Pratt said in a polite but stern voice. Eloise looked up at her, her face unreal, and answered, "Yes, I know." Miss Pratt sighed and looked down at the boarding pass in her hand. She frowned slightly and knit her eyebrows together. The seat number was in first class, but that didn't make sense to her. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Miss Pratt asked. Eloise didn't seem offended, so I'm sure she answered simply. Miss Pratt pressed her lips together and looked behind Eloise to see if a caretaker or family member would step forward to explain the mistake, but no one did. Eloise was traveling alone. Miss Pratt shook her head and said, "There might have been an error. First class is reserved for certain passengers." She said this carefully, as if she were explaining to a child. "Economy boarding is over there." Eloise didn't move. She looked at Miss Pratt with the same calm expression, not arguing and not raising her voice. "There is no mistake," she said after a moment. "This is my seat." Miss Pratt's jaw tightened. She had seen people try to sneak into first class with fake tickets and get upgrades they didn't pay for. She had had enough. With a sharp sigh, she held the ticket up to the overhead lights to see if there were any signs that it wasn't real. "I don't know how you do it," she said. The line behind them was growing, and some people were watching the exchange, some with interest and others pretending not to notice as one or two looked at each other awkwardly. Dorian, the young businessman who had offered Eloise a seat earlier, looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Miss Pratt's voice got louder. "I don't have time for this," she snapped, and Eloise had to move. She slapped Eloise's hand off the counter with a sharp motion. The impact wasn't hard, but the sound echoed through the quiet gate like a lightning strike. Eloise's cane slipped out of her grasp and clattered onto the polished floor, causing a hush among the passengers. A woman named Teresa Langley covered her mouth in shock, and Dorian stiffened, his eyes widening, but Miss Pratt didn't seem to care. "I told you to move," she said coldly. Eloise bent down slowly, her hand steady, as she reached for her cane. There was no anger in her face. She carefully stood up, and her intense gaze fell on Miss Pratt, making the flight attendant take a half-step back. There was a thick, suffocating silence between them until Eloise spoke in a voice so calm it sent a chill through the air. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Miss Pratt laughed, shifting uncomfortably under Eloise's steady gaze. "Ma'am, I don't have time for games. If you don't move, I'll have security take you out." There were murmurs in the crowd. Grew louder. Dorian clenched his teeth and wasn't sure if he should speak up. Teresa, the woman who had gasped earlier, looked around at the other passengers as if hoping someone would speak up, but no one did. Instead, they just watched to see what would happen. Eloise stayed where she was, unmoved. She slowly lifted her cane and gripped the hand with a quiet confidence that made Miss Pratt even more angry. "I'm sitting in first class," Eloise said, her voice still calm. "I'm boarding this flight." Miss Pratt let out a sharp breath. She muttered something under her breath, "Unbelievable," and then looked to a younger flight attendant standing nearby and said, "Leah, call security." Leah hesitated, her eyes darting between Miss Pratt and Eloise. Something didn't feel right about this. The older woman wasn't acting like she had made a mistake. She wasn't panicked or scrambling for excuses. She was too calm, but Miss Pratt's glare was hard to ignore. Before Leah could reach for the intercom, a deep, authoritative voice cut her off. As everyone turned, a senior airline official named Gerald Whitaker strode toward them, his suit neatly pressed, and a badge clipped to his chest. His face couldn't be read, but there was an undeniable weight to his presence. He didn't even look at Miss Pratt before addressing Eloise directly as Mrs. Lancaster. He said, "Sorry for the delay, your seat is waiting for you." Miss Pratt blinked, her mouth opening slightly and then closing again. "What?" Gerald finally turned to face her, his face cool. "Step aside, Miss Pratt," he said. The silence that followed was deafening, and Miss Pratt had to force a laugh as she stiffened her fingers around the boarding pass she was still holding. "There has to be some kind of mistake," she said, forcing a strain. "I mean Gerald cut her off with a sharp look. "There is no mistake." His voice was even, but the authority in his tone sent a chill through Miss Pratt. Leah stood still and felt a weight in her stomach. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew something was. Teresa Langley, who was still standing near the boarding line, looked at Dorian with wide eyes. The crowd was no longer just murmuring, they were now whispering, with people leaning toward each other in quiet speculation. Miss Pratt's face burrowed as she looked between Gerald and Eloise. The older woman was completely calmly watching the scene play out with an expression that couldn't be read. This made Miss Pratt's nerves fray even more, so she tried to regain control by putting her shoulders back. She said, "There was a problem with the ticket, and I was just following the rules." Gerald looked at her with narrowed eyes and asked, "Did you check the system before removing her from the boarding line?" Miss Pratt hesitated. She said she had scanned the ticket, but she hadn't actually checked the system. She had just assumed that was what happened. The thought made Gerald sick to her stomach. Gerald didn't wait for an answer. He told Leo to take Mrs. Lancaster to her seat, and Leah quickly agreed. "Right this way, ma'am," Eloise said in a soft voice. She took slow, deliberate steps and lightly tapped her cane on the floor as she went through the crowd of people. They parted to make room for her like water around a stone. Miss Pratt could feel her heart beating fast in her ears. Gerald stepped closer and lowered his voice so that only she could hear him. When this flight takes off, I suggest you prepare for a very serious conversation, he said. Miss Pratt swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of every eye on her burning into her like a fire. The spotlight made the ground shake, and Miss Pratt stood still as Gerald walked away. His words hung in the air like an invisible noose, tightening around her. Her heart raced, and her confidence was shaken. The other passengers slowly went back to their own conversations, but a few still looked at her with interest. She knew what they were thinking. What had she done? Leah led Eloise through the jet bridge, being careful and respectful. Unlike Miss Pratt, she hadn't ignored the elderly woman. Leah was sure of it after hearing how Gerald had talked to Eloise. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said as they got to the first-class cabin. "I should have stepped in sooner." Eloise gave a small smile and settled into her seat with practiced ease. "It's okay, dear," she said, adjusting her cane next to her. "I'd dealt with people like her before." Leah hesitated and lowered her voice. "Who are you?" Eloise's eyes sparkled with something that Leah couldn't read, but she didn't answer. Leah didn't ask for more information, she just nodded and walked away, but her mind was still buzzing with questions. At the front of the plane, Miss Pratt forced herself to move, but her steps were stiff and robotic as she walked toward the galley. She needed a moment to breathe and think about what had just happened. Why had Gerald reacted that way? Why had that old woman walked off as if she had won something? She reached for a cup of water with shaking hands, her mind still racing. Before she could take a sip, the intercom went off. "Miss Pratt, please report to the cockpit." The paper cup crumpled a little in her hands, and her throat went dry. She had never been called to the cockpit before a flight. Whatever was going on, it wasn't good. As she walked to the cockpit, her legs felt heavy, and she thought about all the reasons she could be called. Maybe it was just a procedural matter. Maybe Gerald wanted to have a private word before the flight, but deep down, she knew it wasn't good. She knew better than to go inside, and the tension hit her right away. The captain, Nigel Dawson, was sitting calmly with his hands on the controls, but his eyes were focused on the in-flight operations screen. Next to him, looking at the screen, was Robert Ellington, one of the highest-ranking executives in the airline's corporate office. His expression was blank, but just being there sent a wave of panic for Miss Pratt. Gerald stood to the side with his arms crossed. As soon as she walked into the cockpit, the silence felt like it was suffocating. Miss Pratt Roberts' voice could be heard. Steady but firm, "I need you to explain why you refused a first-class passenger her seat." Miss Pratt's mouth dried up. "I didn't refuse," she stuttered. "I thought there was a mistake with her ticket." Robert's head tilted slightly. "Did you verify that mistake before asking her to step aside?" Miss Pratt hesitated. Captain Dawson sighed and rubbed his temples. Gerald, on the other hand, was less patient. "Answer the question," he demanded. Miss Pratt swallowed hard. "I assumed there was a problem." Robert let out a breath. Miss Pratt's fingers twitched against her uniform as she tried to figure out what she had missed. The woman in question was just an old woman, another passenger, right? When Robert heard her hesitation, he spoke more quietly and coldly. "My name is Eloise Lancaster, and I am the chairwoman of this airline," he said. The words hit Miss Pratt like a slap, and she felt like she could no longer breathe. Captain Dawson looked at her, but Gerald didn't bother hiding his disapproval. Robert's voice came back. "Again, slowly and deliberately, you embarrassed the founder of this company, the woman who built this airline from the ground up, in front of a full boarding gate." Miss Pratt's knees almost gave way. She had slapped the hand of the most powerful woman in the airline industry in front of passengers, employees, and people who would never forget it. Robert waited until there was complete silence before giving her the final blow. "You will fix this right away, or you will not be working here when this plane lands." She couldn't understand what Robert was saying because it kept going through her mind like a relentless drumbeat. Eloise Lancaster, chairwoman, founder, and the most powerful woman in the airline. How had she missed this? How had she been so blind? She forced herself to speak, even though her voice felt strange in her own mouth. I didn't know, she said weakly. I didn't know what Miss Pratt. Gerald's voice cut through the cockpit like a blade. His patience had run out. She didn't look like she belonged, didn't meet your. Miss Pratt flinched at the accusation. That's not true, Robert cut her off. Do you think that if you had known her name you would have treated her the same way? Miss Pratt opened her mouth but couldn't say anything because everyone knew the answer. If she had known who Eloise was, she would have greeted her with respect, escorted her personally, and made sure she had the best service. She wouldn't have dared to question her ticket, and she wouldn't have clapped her hand. The weight of the room was on her, which they already knew. Captain Dawson let out a heavy breath and shifted in his seat. Gerald shook his head, his jaw set in disappointment. Robert, who was still watching on the screen, gave a slow nod as if he had been expecting this outcome the whole time. You will return to Mrs. Lancaster, he said. You will offer her a full public apology in front of the passengers you humiliated her in front of, and then you will personally escort her to her seat and make sure she is treated with the highest level of. Robert said sharply, this is the only thing standing between you and immediate termination. If you refuse, you will not finish this flight in uniform. Miss Pratt knew she had no choice but to nod stiffly and whisper, I understand. Captain Dawson didn't say a word, and no one showed her any sympathy. As she turned on her heel and walked out of the cockpit, her body felt heavy. As soon as she stepped back into the seat, she felt like she was on fire. She thought the shift passengers were calm now, but their eyes were still on her. They knew something had happened, maybe not everything, because the whispers from the gate had followed her here, and now every step she took toward Eloise Lancaster felt like a walk of shame. Eloise was sitting comfortably in her seat, her posture relaxed, and her cane resting next to her. Leah stood nearby, watching carefully, not knowing what was about to happen. Miss Pratt stalked next to Eloise, her hands shaking a little as she spoke. Mrs. Lancaster, she forced herself to say the words she never thought she'd have to say. I need to apologize for how I treated you earlier. Her voice cracked, but she swallowed the lump in her throat and tried again. I need to apologize for how I treated you earlier. Eloise slowly turned her head toward her. The elderly woman's face stayed calm, but there was something unreadable and sharp in her eyes. As the moment stretched between them, people nearby shifted their attention, and Leah held her breath, waiting for M. Pratt to speak. I had humiliated this person, she said. She had treated her like an inconvenience and like she didn't belong, and now she was the one feeling small. She took a deep breath and said, I misjudged you. I was wrong, and I sincerely apologize. Eloise looked at her and tilted her head slightly to say, I apologize for what exactly? Miss Pratt's stomach turned, and she wanted to run away to end this as soon as possible, but she knew she couldn't until she made things right, so she forced herself to say, I assumed you didn't belong in first class. I treated you unfairly, and I'm sorry. Disrespected you in front of everyone. Eloise didn't answer right away. She let the words hang in the air so that Miss Pratt could feel their weight. Finally, she nodded once and said, Thank you for your apology. Miss Pratt thought that was the end of it, but then Eloise picked up her water glass, took a small sip, and said something that made Miss Pratt's stomach drop. Tell them whose air has shifted, she said, pointing to the passengers who had seen what happened. People who had seen her slap the airline chairwoman's hand accepted her apology, Eloise said, setting her glass down. But they need to hear it too. Miss Pratt felt the blood drain from her face. As Eloise's words filled the air, passengers who had been sneaking looks at the scene now stared openly, waiting to see what would happen next. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin with silence, but the tension was high inside. Titan apologizing to Eloise had been embarrassing enough, but now she was being asked to admit her mistake in front of everyone. She could already feel the judgmental looks, whispers, and silent condemnations from people who hadn't done anything when it mattered. Why should she be the only one held accountable? But she didn't have a choice. Robert Ellington had made it clear that if she didn't make this right, her career was over before the plane even took off. She forced herself to swallow hard and forced herself to say what she had said. She turned toward the cabin with her hands clenched into fists at her sides and slowly uncrossed them, forcing her arms to rest stiffly in front of her. Her throat hurt, and she tried to speak, but the words barely came out. The moment felt too big and overwhelming. She looked at Gerald, who was now standing at the front of the cabin watching her with arms crossed. He didn't feel sorry for her. He just expected her to get out of the hole she had dug for herself. Miss Pratt took a deep breath and spoke louder, forcing her to speak. A murmur went through the cabin as a few people sat up straighter. Dor, the businessman from earlier, raised an eyebrow, his fingers still tapping idly on the armrest of his seat. Teresa Langley, the woman who had gasped when Eloise was hit, watched with quiet satisfaction. Miss Pratt forced herself to continue earlier before we boarded. I made an assumption about a passenger that was wrong. I was unfair to Mrs. Lancaster. I questioned her. She paused and took a sharp breath. Pride was clawing at her like an open wound, she said. The words felt like thorns on her tongue, I told her. I put my hands on her in a way that was completely inappropriate. The cabin murmur grew louder. Some people looked at each other in surprise. Others nodded, knowing they had seen the slap and heard Miss Pratt's condescending tone, but hearing her admit it made the moment hit her differently. Miss Pratt's heart beat fast. She had to lift her chin a little to own up to what she had done, even though it made her feel exposed. What I did was unprofessional, uncalled for, and completely unacceptable, she said, her voice quieter now, and for that I sincerely apologize. There was a heavy silence that followed, and Miss Pratt didn't know what she had expected, maybe some kind of acknowledgement or for someone to just move on with their life, but the worst part was that everyone just stared. There was no applause or verbal forgiveness, just a long stare. She felt like the weight of her mistake was pressing down on her like a boulder for a long time. Finally, Eloise spoke up, "Thank you for your apology." Her voice was as calm as ever, but she added, "I hope you understand something, Miss Pratt." Miss Pratt turned back to face her, scared of what was to come. Eloise leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes locked on Miss Pratt's. "If I were just another elderly woman, if I were just another passenger, do you think you would be standing here right now?" The question hit her like a punch in the gut. Miss Pratt's breath caught because she knew the answer. If Eloise had been someone else, like the airline's chairwoman, there would have been no intervention, no apology, and no consequences. Miss Pratt would have gone about her day as if nothing had happened. The people around her shifted uncomfortably, some looked away, while others held their gazes firm, waiting to see if she would dare to deny it. Miss Pratt's hands clenched again, but this time it wasn't anger. She swallowed. When she finally spoke, it was a quiet no, and she admitted, "I wouldn't." Eloise didn't react right away. She just studied her as if looking for something deeper, and then she gave her a small knowing nod and leaned back in her seat. Miss Pratt's stomach twisted as she turned, wanting to get away from the attention that was now burning against her skin. But before she could leave, Gerald's voice stopped her cold. "Miss Pratt, escort Mrs. Lancaster for the rest of this flight personally." Miss Pratt fell silent, her eyes widening slightly. That wasn't just a punishment. Eloise's presence alone would be a constant reminder of her mistake. She would have to serve the woman she had insulted instead of running to the galley and hiding from the rest of the flight. Eloise, meanwhile, just picked up her book and turned the page. It was clear that this wasn't over yet, and Miss Pratt felt her whole body tense at Gerald's words, escort Mrs. Lancaster for the rest of the flight. Personally, it wasn't a request, it was a demand, and she had no choice but to follow it. Part of her wanted to argue that another flight attendant could handle it, but she had already pushed her luck too far. Apologizing in front of everyone had broken her pride, but this was even worse. The noise in the cabin had stopped, but the air still felt thick with tension. People weren't just watching. They were waiting to see how Miss Pratt would deal with her new reality, Leah. Gerald's sharp gaze made it clear that she had to step in, and Miss Pratt forced herself to move. She turned stiffly back toward Eloise, clasping her hands tightly in front of her. "If there's anything you need, Mrs. Lancaster," she said with a strained voice, "please don't hesitate to ask." Eloise didn't look up from her book right away. She finished a line slowly before slowly turning her gaze toward Miss Pratt. There was no smugness in her face, she was just the same calm authority she had shown from the beginning. "I'll keep that in mind," Eloise said before going back to reading. It was clear that Miss Pratt had been fired. As she turned to stand near the front of the cabin, where everyone could see her, she felt her face burn. Gerald gave her one last look before stepping toward the cockpit, satisfied. Leah looked at Miss Pratt for a moment, giving her a look that was hard to read, maybe pity or something else. "I can help if you need." Leah quietly offered, "Let me help you," but Miss Pratt clenched her teeth and said, "I've got this handled." Leah nodded, but didn't seem convinced. With one last look at Eloise, she walked away, leaving Miss Pratt standing awkwardly by herself. She could feel the eyes on her passengers, who were pretending to be busy with their magazines or screens but were still very aware of what had just happened. Dorian Vance, the businessman from earlier, didn't even bother pretending to study her. He was openly tapping her shoulder. His face wasn't mocking or sympathetic. It was like he was watching a lesson play out that he wasn't sure Miss Pratt had fully learned. Miss Pratt forced herself to stand tall, even though her insides were twisted into knots and she had never felt so small. As the flight went on, Miss Pratt did her best to ignore the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her. She kept moving and working, forcing herself to act like nothing had happened, but she couldn't ignore it. Eloise felt like the old woman next to her was bigger than life every time she walked by. It wasn't because she was doing anything, she was just sitting there reading, drinking water, and occasionally looking out the window. But every once in a while, the old woman's eyes would flicker to Miss Pratt for a second, not with malice or anger, but just watching. And that was even worse when Miss Pratt brought a new tray of drinks through the first-class cabin, carefully setting them down in front of passengers as she went. Eloise's seat, she wasn't sure if she should say anything or just put the drink down and leave. Eloise looked up at her, but Miss Pratt's face couldn't be read. "I brought you some fresh water," she finally said, her voice quieter than usual. "Thank you," Eloise said, putting down her book. Miss Pratt reached out to put the glass on the table, but her hands weren't as steady as they should have been, and the glass shook a little before landing with a soft clink. She never fumbled while serving or doing simple tasks, but Eloise noticed that Miss Pratt's hands were shaking a little and quickly straightened her posture. But before she could leave, Eloise spoke again. "You've been with this airline for a long time, haven't you?" Miss Pratt replied cautiously. "Yes," Eloise replied. "And in all that time, has anyone ever questioned whether you belonged here?" Miss Pratt's stomach turned as she realized what Eloise was really asking. Has anyone ever thought she wasn't fit for her job? No one had ever fired her before she had a chance to prove herself. She had always walked through the cabin with confidence. She had never been put down or told she didn't belong, but that's exactly what she did to Eloise. Miss Pratt's mouth felt dry, and she didn't know what to say. She wanted to defend herself by saying that it wasn't about that and that she was just doing her job and trying to keep things in order, but that would be lying. So for the first time in a long time, Miss Pratt didn't say anything. Eloise didn't push further. She just picked up her water, took a slow sip, and went back to her book. Miss Pratt turned away, but the conversation hung over her like a shadow. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was ashamed. Miss Pratt moved through the first-class seat like a ghost, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't get rid of. Every step felt heavier, and every look from other passengers reminded her of the time she lost control. She used to be in charge of flights, making sure everything ran smoothly and passengers followed the rules. But now she was the one being put in her place. She tried to concentrate on her work, pouring drinks, straightening trays, and forcing smiles on passengers who still looked at her with lingering curiosity, but her mind kept going back to Eloise's words. "Has anyone ever questioned whether you belonged here?" Miss Pratt knew the answer, and she hated that she knew it at the front of the plane. Gerald stood near the galley with his arms crossed and watched her move stiffly through the aisles. She could feel his eyes on her, following every mistake and hesitation. "You're struggling," he finally said when she got to the galley. "I'm fine," she muttered as she reached for a tray of refreshments. "Number you're not," Miss Pratt snapped, but she didn't answer. Gerald leaned slightly against the counter and lowered his voice so only she could hear what she had been saying. "This job for a long time, Pratt, long enough to know better than what she said." Miss Pratt stiffened as Gerald continued, and that assumption wasn't about her ticket or the rules. It was about what she thought a first-class passenger should look like. Miss Pratt's fingers dug into the edge of the counter as Gerald spoke again, this time with a firm voice. "It matters what you did." Miss Pratt felt the pain of those words, but she wouldn't let it show. Gerald looked at her for a long time and then gave her a slow knowing nod. "I already apologize," she said in a flash. "But do you even understand why you're apologizing?" Miss Pratt's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him that she knew she had made a mistake, that she had disrespected a passenger, that she had misjudged the situation, but she knew that wasn't what he was asking. He wasn't asking if she knew what she had done, he was asking if she understood why she was sorry. Miss Pratt turned away and distracted herself with a napkin that didn't need to be adjusted. "I need to get back to work," she muttered. Gerald didn't push any further, he just let out a sigh and stepped back. "Get back to work," he said simply. As she left the galley, his words lingered. The flight went on without any more problems. People settled into their seats, ate, and drank, but Miss Pratt could feel the energy had changed. She wasn't in charge anymore. She wasn't a respected, competent flight attendant. As flight attendant in charge of the cabin, she was the lesson, and everyone on that plane learned something from seeing her fall. Dorian Vance, the businessman from earlier, caught her eye as she walked past his seat. "Quite the day, huh?" he thought as he sipped his drink. "Just another flight," Miss Pratt said, trying to sound casual. Dorian smirked. "Sure," he said, not convinced. He looked at Eloise, who was sitting perfectly still and turning the pages of her book. Then he looked back at Miss Pratt and said, "You know I travel first class." "Usually I respect that," he said in a low voice. "I've seen flight attendants like you before, strict, efficient, and with no time for nonsense." Miss Pratt's eyebrow flickered a little. "Usually," Dorian shrugged, swirling the liquid in his glass. "Usually," he repeated. "But today I saw someone who thought she could decide who longed and who didn't." He took a slow sip, letting the words hang between them. "That's not respect, that's bias." Miss Pratt felt the head of his words like a slap. She wanted to leave. But she couldn't because she knew in her heart that he was right. Dorian didn't say anything else, he just went back to his drink. The conversation was over, and Miss Pratt walked away, but the weight in her chest only got heavier. She had thought for years that she was good at her job because she followed the rules, but today she realized she had been following her own rules, ones that had nothing to do with the airline's rules and everything to do with her own assumptions, and now she was paying for it. Miss Pratt moved through the cabin stiff because she couldn't get her mind off of the thoughts she didn't want to face. She had spent years thinking she was the kind of flight attendant who upheld standards, kept things in order, and made sure everything ran smoothly. But today she had to admit that she had used those standards as an excuse for her own biases. She hated how easily Dorian's words had cut through her. That's not respect, that's bias. He had said it so plainly and without emotion that she had. It might have been obvious to everyone but her, but she reached the galley and put her hands on the counter to steady herself. The hum of the plane filled the air, but she could still hear Gerald's voice, Dorian's voice, and Eloise's voice all telling her the same thing: she had been wrong, and not just about Eloise. She had been wrong about how she saw people in general. She had looked at Eloise and decided before the older woman even spoke that Eloise wasn't. Nothing would have happened if Gerald hadn't stepped in and if Eloise Lancaster hadn't been Eloise Lancaster. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut as her fingers curled around the cool metal of the counter. What did that say about her? The income cracked into life, jerking her out of her thoughts. The captain's voice came through her, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing, M. Pratt." She straightened up and brushed off her uniform as if she could get rid of the discomfort that was pressing down on her. She went through the motions as she had done thousands of times before, checking seat belts, tray tables, and other items to make sure everything was in order, but she wasn't really there. Her mind was still at the date where she had made the wrong decision and never once second-guessed herself. When she got to Eloise's seat, the older woman was already buckled in, her hands resting gently over her lap and looking out the window. Miss Pratt stood there for a moment, not sure what to say or even if she could say anything. Before she could decide, Eloise spoke without turning her head. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" Miss Pratt tensed up a little as she thought about what Eloise said, even though she knew exactly what she meant. Eloise finally turned to face her, her face blank as she asked, "Why did you do that?" Miss Pratt opened her mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come because Eloise was right. She had been thinking about it ever since she got out of the cockpit and had to face the whole cabin and take responsibility for what she had done. Now that she was here in front of Eloise, she didn't have any more excuses. The plane jolted slightly as the landing gear lowered, letting them know they were almost there. But inside the cabin, everything felt too still and quiet. Miss Pratt finally let out a breath and said, "I don't know why I did it." It was the first time she had ever. The truth was told, Eloise looked at her for a long time before nodding once. "Figure it out," she said simply. Miss Pratt swallowed hard, but she nodded because she realized for the first time that she needed to. She wasn't sure if she could fix this or even if she deserved to, but she did know that this mistake would follow her long after the plane touched down. The wheels of the plane hit the runway with a smooth but firm landing, and a quiet murmur went through the. People moved around in their seats and clicked their seat belts as they instinctively tried to unbuckle them, even though the sign was still lit. Over the intercom, a calm and professional voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. On behalf of our crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today." The usual rustling sounds of post-flight anticipation filled the cabin as people stretched and moved around in their seats. As they gathered their things, Miss Pratt didn't feel the usual comfort she did after a landing. Instead, she felt something she had never felt before: dread. Her stomach turned as she looked toward the jet bridge, knowing that whatever was waiting for her outside the plane wasn't going to be good. At the front of the first-class cabin, Gerald was already on the phone with ground operations, his back straight and posture firm as ever, but there was a slight tension in his body. Movements that told Miss Pratt he wasn't just getting ready for another normal arrival. Eloise, on the other hand, was as calm as ever as she reached for her purse and came. She didn't seem in a hurry to get off the plane like most other passengers. Instead, she moved with the same steady patience she had shown from the start. But when her eyes flickered to Miss Pratt, the weight behind them was heavier. Miss Pratt had to stand tall. She had done what they asked, she had apologized, she had faced the shame. She had served Eloise without complaint for the rest of the flight, so why did it still feel like this wasn't over? The seatbelt sign went off, and right away people started getting their bags together and walking into the aisles. First-class passengers moved at their usual, unhurried pace, taking their time as they reached for their designer carry-ons and neatly folded coats. Dorian Van stood and adjusted his suit jacket before turning to Miss Pratt and saying, "Well, that was certainly eventful," while carrying his bag. Before Miss Pratt could say anything, Dorian looked at her for a moment and then gave her a slow nod. I'm sure she felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Without waiting for a response, Dorian got off the plane and disappeared into the jet bridge. Miss Pratt took a deep breath and braced herself. She knew she had to keep working even though her hands felt heavier and her legs felt unsteady. She turned back to Eloise and watched as the older woman adjusted the. She moved slowly and lightly, holding her cane in one hand. There was no sign that she was ready to leave. Instead, Eloise finally met Miss Pratt's gaze again, studying her like someone would study an unsolved puzzle. Miss Pratt felt exposed under that gaze. Then Eloise spoke. "Walk with me," she said. Miss Pratt blinked and said, "Excuse me." Eloise gave a small nod toward the open jet bridge. Walk with me wasn't a request. Miss Pratt shook her head, every muscle in her body screaming at her to find a reason to. Gerald's voice cut through her hesitation. "Go," he said, making it clear that she didn't have a choice. Miss Pratt clenched her jaw, breathed out through her nose, and stiffly nodded. As Eloise Lancaster got off the plane, Miss Pratt followed. The walk through the jet bridge felt endless, and Miss Pratt could feel the slight shift in the air. As soon as they stepped into the airport terminal, something was waiting for her. Eloise walked slowly and steadily, her cane lightly tapping against the floor. With every step Eloise took, Miss Pratt stayed a half-step behind her, keeping her back straight and breathing normally. Passengers naturally separated as Eloise moved, but it wasn't just because she was old, there was an air of authority about her. Miss Pratt had spent years running flights and keeping passengers and staff under control, but now that she was walking next to Eloise, she felt more helpless than ever. The terminal ahead got busier, and travelers' noise filled the air. Then Miss Pratt saw them, a group of executives from an airline stood near a restricted entrance. In the middle of them stood Robert Ellington, and next to him stood airport security. Miss Pratt's breath caught, and her steps slowed for a second, but Eloise kept walking. As they got closer, Miss Pratt could feel her fate closing in. She knew something bad was going to happen, but seeing security standing there made it real, and she wasn't ready for it. Her heart was pounding in her ribs, but she tried to keep a neutral expression on her face. The executive stood up when Eloise spoke. As they walked up, Robert Ellington was the first to speak. He greeted Mrs. Lancaster with a polite nod and said, "I hope your flight was informative." Eloise gave him a small knowing smile and said, "Yes, it was." Robert's eyes then flickered to Miss Pratt. "Miss Pratt," he said in a cool, professional voice, "We need to have a conversation." Miss Pratt's fingers twitched at her sides as he said, "Sir." Robert held up a hand and said, "Come with us." Miss Pratt felt her stomach drop. Eloise took a step forward and raised her voice. Being calm and firm, she said, "Won't you, Miss Pratt?" Miss Pratt's throat felt dry. She had spent the whole flight trying to convince herself that she had already paid the price and that being embarrassed was enough. But now, standing in front of the airline's top executives and security officers waiting to take her away, she realized that this was just the start of her career. Her reputation and her entire future with the airline were about to be decided, and for the first time she felt scared. Miss Pratt stood frozen, her mind barely able to process what was happening around her. The hum of the airport terminal felt distant and muffled, like a crushing weight of reality was settling on her chest. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist, this was serious. Robert Ellington stood firm, his expression unreadable, but the fact that security was waiting by his side told Miss Pratt everything she needed to know. This wasn't a quiet discussion behind closed doors. This was a reckoning. Eloise Lancaster to stand next to her and watch with the same knowing look on her face. She wasn't bragging or angry, she just wanted Miss Pratt to face what she had done. There was no more running away from it. "Miss Pratt," Robert said again, his voice carrying just enough authority to cut through her racing thoughts, "Come with us." For the first time in her career, Miss Pratt hesitated. She had never been on the other side of a confrontation. She had never been told to step forward and explain herself. She had always been in charge, but now she felt like a liability as she was led off the plane. She forced herself to move her stiff legs forward, pulling her along with Robert as they walked toward the executive offices. Security officers followed closely behind. It wasn't quite an arrest, but it felt like one. People still in the terminal watched, some with open curiosity and others quickly looking away as if they didn't notice, but they did, just like on the plane. The whispers had already started. They reached a set of glass doors with the airline's logo prominently displayed across them. Beyond those doors, Miss Pratt knew her fate would be decided. Robert swapped his badge, and the doors unlocked with a quiet beep. He motioned for her to step inside, but Miss Pratt hesitated and cast one last glance at Eloise. The older woman was watching, still calm and collected, but there was something in her eyes that Miss Pratt couldn't put her finger on, so she turned away and stepped away. Inside, the doors shut behind her, and the conference room was cold, not in temperature but in atmosphere. The long, polished table sparkled under the fluorescent lights, its surface immaculate and untouched, but the tension in the room was suffocating. James Whitmore, senior operations manager, was sitting at the head of the table, and as soon as Miss Pratt walked in, he fixed his sharp gaze on her. Two other executives, each with a folder in front of them, sat down next to her. Miss Pratt lowered herself into the chair at the far end of the table with a stiff back. The security guards stood still near the door, like sentinels. James leaned forward and lacing his fingers together. "You know why you're here?" he asked. Miss Pratt forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir." James looked at her with an expression that couldn't be read. "Then tell me," he said in a voice, "even what happened on that flight." The words felt like a trap, and Miss Pratt's first thought was to defend herself and say that she had been doing her job. She said she had been following the rules and that it was all a misunderstanding, but she knew better now, so she took a deep breath and answered honestly, "I made an assumption about a passenger," which is what she said. "And because of that assumption, I treated her unfairly." James didn't react, nod his head, or show disappointment. He just waited. Miss Pratt swallowed hard. "I humiliated her publicly," she continued. "I fired her, and when she didn't step aside, I put my hands on her." James finally leaned back in his chair. "Do you realize what you did?" Miss Pratt's fingers curled slightly against her lap as she said it. Yes, the other executives looked at each other. They hadn't expected her to say it so directly. James let out a breath through his nose. Miss Pratt, you've been with this airline for how long? He asked. 10 years. She answered. 10 years. He repeated, shaking his head. Then you should already know that what you did is grounds for immediate termination. Miss Pratt's stomach clenched. She knew those words, but hearing them out loud made them real. James opened the folder in front of him and skimming through it. There are passenger statements, a report from the captain, and a complaint filed directly by Mrs. Lancaster. Miss Pratt's breath caught. She hadn't realized Eloise had filed a complaint. The weight of it settled heavily on her chest. James closed the folder and put his hands on the table. You're only in this room instead of being escorted out of the building because Mrs. Lancaster specifically asked that we give you a chance to speak before a decision is made, he said. Surprised, she said before she could stop herself, please keep James's gaze firm. Miss Pratt couldn't believe it after everything she had done and how she had treated Eloise. Why would the older woman fight for her to have a chance to explain herself? She turned slightly and looked through the glass doors at Eloise sitting in the lounge outside, still watching. Miss Pratt didn't understand, but for the first time since she walked into the room, she felt something new. She slowly breathed out as she turned back to the table. I know I deserve to be fired, she said in a quieter voice. But I don't want my last moment at this airline to be about what I did wrong. She raised her chin, her throat tight, but her voice steady. I want to prove that I can learn from it. James Whitmore raised an eyebrow. How exactly do you plan to do that? Miss Pratt asked. For the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. There was a heavy silence in the conference room. As Miss Pratt's words filled the room, she could feel all eyes on her. James Whitmore's cold and assessing the other executives wary and unconvinced. Even the security guard standing by the door seemed to be waiting to see if she had anything important to say. She swallowed and pushed down the lump in her throat. She had spent the whole flight defending herself, telling herself that she had already done enough to make up for what had happened, but now she knew the truth. Saying sorry wasn't enough. James leaned forward and lightly tapped the table. Miss Pratt, do you even understand why the situation is as serious as it is? Miss Pratt took a deep breath and asked, do you even understand why the situation is as serious as it is? She had expected this and was ready for it, but now that she was being asked to say the words out loud, they felt heavy on her. She thought about when she had stalked Eloise at the gate and how she had let her go without even checking the system. Because she already knew in her heart that Eloise Lancaster didn't belong in first class, Miss Pratt straightened up and forced herself to own it. I thought I was just following protocol, she said, but I wasn't. James raised an eyebrow and asked, then what were you doing? Miss Pratt slowly breathed out, I was making a decision based on my own assumptions. The room was still, but she could feel the shift. She hesitated, but only for a moment, because for the first time she wasn't afraid to say it. Out loud, I looked at Mrs. Lancaster and thought she wasn't supposed to be in first class. She said I didn't check her ticket properly and I didn't listen when she tried to correct me. When she didn't move, I got angry and put my hands on her stomach, twisting it as she admitted it all. James's eyes didn't waver. So you're admitting that your actions weren't just a mistake, they were based on bias? The word made Miss Pratt's skin crawl, but she couldn't deny it. She slowly nodded yes. The confession felt like pulling a knife out of her chest, but as soon as she said it, she realized something. It was the first time she had really admitted it, not just to keep her job or because it was expected, but because she finally understood. James leaned back and folded his arms, and the other executives exchanged blank looks, but no one spoke. It was the first time Miss Pratt realized they hadn't expected her to say that. They were expecting her to make excuses or some desperate attempt to defend herself. James slowly let out a breath, and he asked Miss Pratt, "Sir, what do you plan to do now?" She blinked. "You say you want to prove you've learned something, but words don't mean anything unless they're actioned upon," he asked. Miss Pratt wasn't sure what she could do. The damage was already done. The passengers had seen what happened. The airline's reputation was at risk, and she had already lost their trust. But she didn't want this to be the end of her story. She took a deep breath and collected her thoughts. She said, "Don't expect to walk out of here with my job, and I don't expect forgiveness either. But if I'm given the chance, I want to help fix the kind of environment that made me feel justified in what I did." James's expression stayed neutral, but he didn't cut her off. "Airline teaches us about policies, about safety, about service," Ms. Pratt said. "But I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to serve all passengers equally. I thought I did, but I didn't, and if I'm allowed to stay, I want to help fix the kind of environment that made me feel justified in what I did." The room was silent. Miss Pratt wasn't sure if what she said was right, but it was the only thing that felt real. James looked at her for a long time before finally speaking. "Wait outside," he told her. Miss Pratt nodded and stiffly rose from her seat. This time, the security guards didn't move to escort her out, which she saw as a small victory. As she stepped back into the waiting area, her breath felt shaky, and she saw Eloise Lancaster still sitting there waiting. Eloise turned her head and her eyes lit up. Meeting Miss Pratt and, for the first time since the whole thing started, Miss Pratt didn't want to look away. As she stood there facing Eloise Lancaster, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her, Miss Pratt didn't try to avoid the older woman's gaze. She didn't shift uncomfortably, and she didn't act like she wasn't on the verge of losing everything. She just waited. Eloise Lancaster, as calm as ever, put her purse on the table and said, "They're talking about your future in there." She spoke evenly, as if she were having a normal conversation with a stranger. But they weren't strangers anymore, not after today. Miss Pratt swallowed. "I know," Eloise said with a slight tilt of her head. "And what do you think they'll decide?" Miss Pratt hesitated. If someone had asked her that question an hour ago, she would have still been fighting for her job, still scrambling for excuses, still telling herself she could talk her way out of this, but she wasn't sure she deserved to. She let out a tight breath and said, "I don't know," adding, "I guess that depends on whether they believe I can change." Eloise looked at her carefully and lightly tapped her fingers on the cane's handle. "Can you?" Miss Pratt asked. Her fingers twitched at her sides. "I'd like to try," she said. Finally, Eloise gave a soft hum of acknowledgement, which felt heavier than anything else. Miss Pratt took a deep breath and then finally asked the question she had been afraid to ask, "Why did you do that?" Eloise's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "I wanted to see if you would use that chance to defend yourself or if you would use it to face the truth," she said. Miss Pratt felt sick to her stomach. That was what this was all about. Eloise had given her a chance to talk, but not because she wanted to hear excuses or because she wanted Miss Pratt to keep her job. She wanted to see if Miss Pratt could even understand what she had done, and Miss Pratt finally understood something too. Eloise wasn't helpless at the gate. She let Miss Pratt show her true nature, and when that nature showed something ugly, Eloise let herself be wrong until she had to face it. Miss Pratt exhaled slowly. "You could have demanded that I be fired immediately." Eloise's gaze didn't waver. "Yes," she said simply. Miss Pratt hesitated, then asked the second question that was on the back of her mind, "Why didn't you?" Eloise was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because I don't believe in letting people get away with their mistakes without learning from them." The word made Miss Pratt feel strange and unfamiliar. This wasn't a gesture of kindness or favor. Eloise Lancaster had never needed an apology from her or justice from the airline. What she had wanted was for Miss Pratt to face herself, and that's exactly what happened. The doors to the conference room opened, and Miss Pratt turned around instantly, catching her breath slightly as James Whitmore walked in. Still unable to read, the other executives kept their postures rigid and fixed their gazes on Miss Pratt. Robert Ellington stayed at the door and glanced between them before finally saying, "We've made our decision." Miss Pratt's hands curled slightly at her sides as she braced herself, and James carefully studied her. "Effected immediately, you are being placed on probation," he told her. Miss Pratt's breath hitched as she heard the news. She had been hoping for one of two outcomes: either she would keep her job or she would be fired. But probation meant something different. She was being given a chance. James kept his voice firm. "You will receive additional training, including leadership and anti-bias programs. Your role will be evaluated for the next 6 months, and if you fail to meet expectations at any point, you will be fired without further discussion." Miss Pratt didn't know what to say. She thought she was ready for any answer, but she wasn't expecting this. She wasn't getting off easy. She wasn't walking away without consequences. She was given the chance to show if she could really change things. The reality of it hit her like a heavy load. James narrowed his eyes a little and asked, "Do you understand?" Miss Pratt straightened her back and said, "Yes, sir." James then looked at Eloise and said, "Mrs. Lancaster has signed off on this decision. If she wanted you fired, you would have been." Miss Pratt slowly turned back to Eloise, and the older woman met her gaze without hesitation. "I hadn't fought for Miss Pratt to keep her job. I fought for her to earn it." Miss Pratt swallowed hard and said, "Thank you." Eloise gave her a slow nod, "Make it mean something," and then she turned and walked away. Miss Pratt stood there and watched as Eloise Lancaster walked away with the same steady grace she had shown throughout the whole ordeal. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her cane hit the polished airport floor softly with each step, fading away until she disappeared into the crowd for the first time since it all started. Pratt didn't feel resentment, anger, or even relief. Instead, she felt small, not in the way she had when she had been embarrassed in front of the passengers or when Gerald had called her out, but in the way someone feels when they realize how much they still need to learn. She had spent years thinking she knew everything there was to know about her job, that she could read people before they spoke, that she could tell who belonged and who didn't, and that she had the power to do all of these things. Decide the order of things, but she was wrong, and Eloise Lancaster had shown her that. James Whitmore's voice brought her back to reality. "Report to training headquarters first thing Monday morning," he said. "You'll receive further instruction." Miss Pratt stiffly nodded, "Yes, sir." James gave her one last look, then looked at the other executives, and they turned and walked away, leaving Miss Pratt standing there alone. She slowly let out a breath and unclenched her fists. She had a second chance, but it wasn't a clean slate. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a test that she wasn't sure she could pass. The airport was busy with people coming and going, unaware of the lesson that had just happened in its halls. Miss Pratt turned toward the terminal windows and stared out at the rows of planes lined up along the tarmac. She saw that somewhere else, another flight attendant was making the same snap decisions she had made about another passenger, and she wondered for the first time in her life how many times she had done the same thing. Many people had left her flights feeling like they had to prove they belonged. She felt uncomfortable thinking about how many passengers had looked her in the eyes and known exactly who she was before she did. But maybe that wasn't supposed to make her uncomfortable. She had spent her whole career making sure the cabin ran exactly how she wanted it to. Now, for the first time, she had to listen, learn, and change. Not being able to choose, Pratt took a deep breath, looked one last time at the empty terminal, and then turned and walked toward the exit. If you liked this story, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.